It's an invisible tech war raging inside your smartphone. Every time you snap a photo or record a video, there's a high chance the tiny camera sensor capturing that image was made by either Sony or Samsung, two of Asia's most powerful tech companies locked in fierce rivalry. This is the battle for CMOS Image Sensors, the silicon eyes of our devices. It's a high-stakes contest most consumers never see, but its outcome shapes the cameras in our phones, cars, and more. How did a Japanese electronics icon and a South Korean conglomerate become arch competitors in this critical component market? And what does their duel mean for the future of photography and beyond? Let's dive into the unseen battlefield where Sony and Samsung are waging a silicon war for image sensor dominance. Sony and Samsung stand as the two pillars of the global image sensor market, together controlling the lion's share of this industry. Sony Semiconductor Solutions, Sony's chip division, has long been the market leader, nearly capturing half of all CMOS image sensor revenues in recent years. In 2020, for example, Sony commanded about 46% of the smartphone image sensor market by revenue, far ahead of Samsung's 29% share. By 2024, Sony's overall CIS market share was approaching 45%, with Samsung around 19%. In other words, these two companies alone account for well over half of the world's image sensor sales, a duopoly in a critical component that powers billions of cameras. Sony's dominance didn't happen overnight. The company built its reputation through decades of expertise in imaging, from camcorder and CCD sensor days to the modern smartphone era. Crucially, Sony became the go-to sensor supplier for many top smartphone brands, most notably Apple. In fact, Apple's iPhones have relied exclusively on Sony image sensors for over a decade. Apple's partnership with Sony, confirmed publicly by Apple's CEO, speaks to Sony's track record in delivering high-performance camera sensors. Whenever you take a photo with an iPhone, it's Sony's technology converting photons to pixels behind the scenes. This close relationship with Apple and other premium phone makers, like Google and many high-end Chinese brands, cemented Sony's status as the premier CIS provider for flagship devices. Samsung, meanwhile, took a different path, one leveraging its vertically integrated electronics empire. Unlike Sony, Samsung makes its own smartphones, the Galaxy series, and uses that in-house demand to fuel its image sensor ambitions. For years, Samsung's flagship Galaxy phones often featured a mix of camera sensors, sometimes Sony's, sometimes Samsung's own. But around the mid-2010s, Samsung began aggressively pushing its System LSI division's image sensors, branding them ISOCELL, into Galaxy devices and beyond. This had a dual benefit. It gave Samsung's sensor business an immediate high-volume customer, Samsung Mobile, and it provided a showcase to prove Samsung's sensors could rival Sony's in real-world phone cameras. Samsung's model meant it could rapidly iterate and deploy new sensor tech in its Galaxy lineup, then market those same sensors to other phone makers. Chinese smartphone manufacturers in particular became eager clients of Samsung, attracted by cutting-edge specs. It's no coincidence that many Xiaomi, Vivo, and Oppo flagship models have proudly advertised Samsung's ultra-high-resolution sensors in recent years. Samsung leveraged these partnerships to steadily grow its market share, climbing firmly into the number 2 position globally. Despite their contrasting approaches, both companies benefited from a smartphone boom that demanded ever better cameras. By 2022, Sony held approximately 44% of the smartphone image sensor market, while Samsung had approximately 30%, with third-place OmniVision at about 17%. In effect, two companies, one Japanese, one Korean, had become the twin giants of an industry supplying every smartphone maker. This Sony versus Samsung rivalry seldom makes headlines, but it defines the pace of innovation in mobile photography. Each company has its strengths. Sony is known for top-notch image quality and advanced sensor designs, and Samsung for bold innovation and willingness to push specs, like higher resolutions, to win clients. The stage was set for a technological arms race between these two pillars. In the race for better image sensors, Sony and Samsung have often pursued different technical innovations, each becoming a battleground of ideas. Two signature technologies epitomize their approaches: Sony's stacked sensor architecture and Samsung's ISO-cell pixel isolation. These technologies aim to solve fundamental challenges in sensor design and gave each company a competitive edge, sparking leapfrog moves as each tried to one-up the other. Sony revolutionized image sensor design in 2012 by introducing the world's first stacked CMOS image sensor. Traditional CMOS sensors up to that point were built on a single substrate. Photodiodes, pixels, and circuitry were planar on the same silicon base. Sony's breakthrough was to separate the sensor into layers. One layer contained the pixel array that converts light to electrical signals, and beneath it, a second layer contained the logic circuits for processing those signals. By fabricating the photodiode layer and logic layer separately and then bonding them, Sony achieved a stacked structure. In essence, they moved supporting circuits beneath the pixels instead of alongside them. This seemingly wonky engineering shift had big payoffs. First, it freed up space on the sensor surface for more pixels or larger pixels, since the wiring and converters could be tucked in a layer below, improving image quality without enlarging the sensor package. Second, it allowed much more complex circuitry to be integrated, even memory. Sony soon leveraged this to build sensors with on-chip DRAM buffers, enabling extremely fast readouts. Famously, Sony's 3-layer stacked sensor in 2017 could shoot 1000 FPS slow-motion video by temporarily storing tons of data on a chip layer. The stacked design also improved power efficiency and helped reduce noise by shortening interconnections. By late 2012, Sony had commercialized its first XMOR RS stacked sensors for smartphones, boasting sharper images and advanced features in a smaller module than ever before. This gave Sony a head start in performance that it defended for years. Its stacked sensors became a key reason many premium phones chose Sony parts. Samsung, for its part, focused on a different innovation around the same time. In 2013, Samsung introduced what it called ISO-cell technology, an approach to improve image quality by physically isolating each pixel on the sensor. The challenge Samsung addressed was crosstalk. On traditional sensors, densely packed pixels can leak light or electrical signal into each other, muddying color and reducing sharpness, especially as pixel sizes shrank. Samsung's ISO-cell created tiny barrier walls between pixels, preventing light from one pixel from spilling into its neighbor. This was especially crucial as consumers demanded higher megapixel counts, which meant smaller pixels crammed together. ISO-cell promised that even at 1 point, 0 micrometers or 0.9 micrometers pixel sizes, much smaller than the pixels of early smartphone cameras, each pixel could faithfully capture its own light information with less interference. By reducing optical bleed and electrical noise between pixels, Samsung could push resolution higher without as severe a hit to image fidelity. In short, ISO-cell lets Samsung shrink pixels while keeping image quality acceptable, a vital capability for the megapixel race that was to come. These two technologies, stacking and ISO-cell, highlight the different philosophies of Sony and Samsung. Sony's stacked architecture tackled the problem of performance and integration at the sensor level, how to build a smarter, faster sensor by redesigning its fundamental structure. Samsung's ISO-cell tackled the pixel-level physics, how to maintain color accuracy and light sensitivity as we pack more smaller pixels onto a chip. Neither company, of course, ignored the other's domain. Sony eventually also adopted forms of pixel isolation. Sony's sensors use their own deep trench isolation techniques to curb crosstalk, and Samsung in recent years began developing stacked designs too. In fact, Samsung is reportedly working on an advanced 3-layer stacked sensor, photodiode, transport, logic, to try to match or exceed Sony's XMOR RS architecture. Early leaks suggest Samsung's upcoming design shortens the distance pixel signals travel and could enable even faster processing, a direct play at Sony's stacking prowess. The gap is that Samsung historically lagged Sony in stacking know-how, while Sony lagged Samsung in aggressive pixel miniaturization. Now each is scrambling to master both approaches. A key example of the tech convergence, backside illumination, BSI, was another sensor innovation, which Sony popularized around 2009, that both companies use, where the sensor is essentially flipped during manufacturing so that the photodiodes receive light from the back of the silicon, avoiding obstruction by wiring. Sony combined BSI plus stack design in its sensors. Samsung combined BSI plus ISO-cell in its sensors. The result? Today's high-end sensors often incorporate all these techniques: BSI for better light capture, isolation for cleaner color, and stacking for better circuitry. But the firsts in these areas belong distinctively to Sony or Samsung. Each new generation of sensor, the two rivals eye each other warily. When Sony added on-chip memory for ultra-fast bursts, Samsung soon after added Super PD autofocus pixels and smart ISO tech to narrow the gap in speed and dynamic range. When Samsung pioneered tiny 0.7 micrometer pixels with ISO-cell 2.0, Sony responded with dual-gain HDR pixels and larger sensor sizes to compensate in low light. It's a constant back-and-forth refinement of the art of capturing light. For the layperson, the takeaway is that the camera sensor inside your phone is a marvel of engineering. And many of those marvels were born from intense competition between these two companies, R&D labs. Nowhere has the Sony versus Samsung rivalry been more visible to consumers than in the megapixel war. This is the contest to pack ever more megapixels into a sensor: 12 megapixels, 48 megapixels, 64 megapixels, 108 megapixels, and now 200 megapixels in the latest smartphones. In the 2010s, as camera-centric phones became hot sellers, Samsung seized on megapixel count as a way to differentiate its sensors and win over smartphone brands, especially in China, that craved headline-grabbing specs. Sony, by contrast, often preached quality over quantity, emphasizing pixel size, sensor size, and readout speed over just the raw megapixel number. The result was a kind of philosophical divergence in what defines a great mobile camera. Is it sheer resolution for bragging rights and detail, or is it larger pixels with better light gathering for superior real-world image quality? Samsung firmly planted its flag on the side of more pixels. In August 2019, Samsung stunned the industry by unveiling the world's first 108-megapixel smartphone image sensor, the ISO-cell Bright HMX. Developed in collaboration with Xiaomi, this 108-megapixel chip marked the first time a phone camera sensor broke into 3-digit megapixel territory, a resolution previously reserved for high-end DSLR cameras. It wasn't just a lab prototype either. Xiaomi promptly put the 108-megapixel sensor in a commercially available phone, and Samsung followed with its own Galaxy S20 Ultra, using a variant of it in early 2020. Samsung touted that the HMX was also one of the largest physical sensors in phones at the time, a 1/1.33-inch optical format, and used tetracell technology, Samsung's term for 4-pixel binning, to effectively turn that avalanche of pixels into brighter 27-megapixel images when needed. In practice, the sensor would merge sets of 4 adjacent pixels into one large pixel for low-light shooting, so your night photos came out as 27 megapixels with much better light sensitivity, while daylight shots could use the full 108 megapixels for insane detail. This was Samsung's strategy: provide the best of both worlds by using computational tricks, pixel binning, to mitigate the downsides of tiny pixels. The gamble paid off in terms of market interest. Chinese brands like Xiaomi, Realme, and Motorola raced to adopt Samsung's 108-megapixel sensor in their flagship or niche models, each wanting to claim the first or highest megapixel title. Not to be outdone, Samsung then pushed the envelope further, introducing 200 megapixel image sensors, its ISO-Cell HP series, by 2021 to 2022. By 2022, Samsung was leading the industry's high-resolution segment, even supplying 200 megapixel CIS products to multiple smartphone makers. This megapixel escalation became a signature of Samsung's sensor business, effectively igniting a spec war that forced everyone, Sony included, to react. Sony, meanwhile, approached things more conservatively. For many years, Sony's flagship sensors for top phones hovered around 12 megapixels, prioritizing larger individual pixel size and excellent low-light performance. For instance, Apple's iPhones famously stuck with 12 megapixel main cameras from 2014, iPhone 6, all the way to 2021, iPhone 13. Apple, relying on Sony sensors, argued that 12 good megapixels were better than 108 mediocre ones, and focused on improving each pixel's quality via sensor size increases and computational photography. As one report noted in 2020, Apple may not have joined in on the high-resolution smartphone trend yet, with its flagship iPhone still using a 12-megapixel sensor. Instead, Apple and Sony worked on things like dual-pixel autofocus, wider dynamic range, and faster multi-frame image processing. Sony also pursued larger sensor formats for phones. For example, it developed a 1-inch type 20-megapixel sensor, roughly 50 megapixels when cropped to 4:3, that made its way into phones like the Xiaomi 12S Ultra in 2022. That sensor's claim to fame was massive 2.4 micrometers physical pixel size when binned 4:1, huge compared to the 0.8 micrometers pixels on Samsung's 108 megapixel sensor. Sony's philosophy here was that a bigger imager with fewer bigger pixels can produce cleaner, more light-rich photographs, especially in low-light or high-dynamic scenes, than an ultra-dense sensor whose tiny pixels struggle in darker conditions. This difference in approach sometimes looked like a tortoise and hare situation. Samsung's high-MP sensors gave it a burst of attention and wins in the market, especially in mid-range and high-end phones from China. Sony initially lost a bit of ground during the high-megapixel rush. Indeed, in 2020, Sony's market share slipped slightly as Samsung and others took advantage of the trend for 48-megapixel plus sensors. Huawei's decline due to sanctions also hurt Sony, since Huawei had been a big Sony sensor customer, giving Samsung an opening to supply other Chinese OEMs hungry for advanced sensors. But Sony was hardly standing still. It answered the more pixels trend by introducing its own quad-buyer sensor designs, essentially Sony's equivalent of pixel binning sensors. In 2018, Sony launched the IMX586, a 48-megapixel smartphone sensor with quad-buyer color filter, which became extremely popular in devices from OnePlus, Xiaomi, and others as a well-rounded alternative. Sony followed up with 64-megapixel and 50-megapixel quad-buyer sensors in subsequent years. These had high resolution but still emphasized larger pixel sizes, often outputting at 12 megapixels or 16 megapixels by combining pixels. Sony also continued to refine speed and readout. Its 50-megapixel sensors could achieve fast multi-frame HDR shots, where all pixels are used for different exposures simultaneously, something it leveraged for image quality rather than just resolution. In essence, Samsung bet on headline specs. Sony bet on balanced performance. Samsung's approach yielded phones touting insane 108-megapixel or 200-megapixel cameras, which certainly grabbed consumer attention. And in good light, these sensors can indeed produce impressively detailed images. Sony's approach meant that phones like the Google Pixel or Apple iPhone, using Sony sensors with moderate megapixel counts, still routinely produced some of the best-looking photos thanks to big sensors and sophisticated processing. Which philosophy is right is an ongoing debate, and in fact, the lines are blurring. By 2023, Sony did increase the resolution in some of its sensors. Apple's iPhone 14 Pro uses a 48-megapixel Sony sensor at last, breaking Apple's 12-megapixel tradition. And Samsung, in its Galaxy flagships, also mixes strategies. The Galaxy S23 Ultra's main camera is 200 megapixels, Samsung made, but it bins to 12 megapixels by default. Meanwhile, that phone's other cameras include lower MP Sony sensors chosen for their particular strengths. The megapixel war has thus evolved into a nuanced battlefield. It's not just about one number, it's about how those pixels are utilized. Sony and Samsung each have to deliver sensors that excel in both high resolution and high quality. One telling quote from industry analysts: Sony drove its share in the market with partnerships on large-sized and high-resolution sensors, while Samsung continued to lead high-resolution demand by supplying 200 megapixel products. In other words, even Sony acknowledges the need to offer higher MP now, and even Samsung knows quality matters beyond the spec sheet. The competition ultimately pushed both to innovate, giving consumers cameras that are leaps and bounds better than a few years ago, whether you favor Sony's approach or Samsung's. Smartphones may have been the primary arena for Sony and Samsung's sensor rivalry, but a new frontier is rapidly expanding. Automotive vision, security surveillance, and other beyond smartphone applications. Both companies recognize that the next wave of growth and competition will be outside our pockets, in our cars, cities, and industries. The opportunity is enormous. Think of every self-driving car's cameras, every smart security camera, every robot's vision system, all needing advanced image sensors. As smartphone demand matures and even declines, Sony and Samsung are racing to ensure they don't miss the boat on these emerging markets. Consider automotive imaging. Modern cars are increasingly loaded with cameras for parking, for lane keeping, for identifying pedestrians, ADAS, advanced driver assistance systems, and eventually for fully autonomous driving. A few years ago, a typical car might have one backup camera. Today, mid-range cars often have multiple front, rear, side cameras, interior driver monitoring cameras, even infrared night vision in some luxury models. On average, new vehicles are approaching 3 to 4 cameras per car, and future vehicles could have 8, 10 or more as autonomous driving features proliferate. The automotive image sensor market is forecast to grow at a double-digit pace, some estimates say approximately 11% compound annual growth rate, through the decade, potentially reaching around $7 billion by 2030. That's smaller than the smartphone camera market, but not by much, and it's all additional demand that didn't exist at such scale before. Both Sony and Samsung see this and have publicly targeted automotive as a key growth area. Sony in particular has made automotive sensors a strategic focus. It already supplies image sensors to many car manufacturers and Tier 1 automotive suppliers. By Sony's internal numbers, it had roughly 25% of the automotive image sensor market by revenue in 2019, and aimed to grow that share to nearly 40%. Sony's automotive sensors emphasize reliability and high dynamic range, crucial for scenarios like a camera that must see both bright skies and dark road details simultaneously. For example, Sony developed automotive-specific CMOS sensors with HDR modes and LED flicker mitigation, so they can effectively capture traffic signs or LED taillights without flicker under various lighting. Sony also isn't shy about tailoring products for cars. It has chips for in-cabin monitoring, watching drivers or passengers, and for exterior sensing, like the IMX424 and others used in many prototypes of self-driving systems. The company even created an automotive business group under its imaging division to underscore its push. The goal is clear. If the 2010s were about Sony sensors in phones, the 2020s should be about Sony sensors in cars, from advanced driver assist cameras all the way to fully autonomous vehicle vision systems. Samsung is also eyeing this area, though its path has been a bit different. Samsung launched a line of ISOCELL auto image sensors, such as the ISOCELL Auto 4AC and 1H1, geared for automotive applications, meeting stringent AEC-Q100 reliability standards and features like an LED corner pixel design for HDR. Samsung's Auto 1H1 is an 8-megapixel sensor designed for forward-facing car cameras, for instance, with special technology to handle both very bright and very dark areas in one shot. Beyond product launches, Samsung recently reorganized its semiconductor division to sharpen focus on high-growth areas, and image sensors, CIS, were identified as a pillar of future growth, along with AI chips. Interestingly, some reports suggest Samsung reallocated engineers from other projects, like certain automotive chip projects, to the image sensor and AI side, seeing more promise there. This indicates Samsung is doubling down on sensors for not just phones, but also new domains like automotive, robotics, and IoT cameras. The company has stated it plans to expand into automotive-grade sensors for autonomous vehicles and robots, where the demand for vision is expected to boom in coming years. Samsung's advantage, again, is its integration. It can leverage its foundry and logic chip expertise to potentially integrate AI processing directly on the image sensor, a trend in next-gen sensors so that cameras can do preliminary image recognition on chip, often termed smart sensors. A big factor in these beyond smartphone arenas is scale versus specialization. Automotive and industrial customers often need highly specialized sensors, for instance, sensors that work in very low light with minimal noise, or that can operate in high temperatures, or global shutter sensors for freeze-frame capture of fast motion. This plays a bit to Sony's strengths, precision engineering and a broad portfolio, and is a newer challenge for Samsung, which built scale in the relatively homogeneous smartphone market. Notably, onsemi, ON Semiconductor, an American company that acquired Aptina Imaging, currently leads the automotive image sensor market with over 40% share, with OmniVision, China-based, second, and Sony third. Samsung is not even top 3 in automotive yet. So both Sony and Samsung are trying to displace incumbents like onsemi in that field. It's truly an open race. Sony brings cutting-edge tech from its consumer sensors and deep imaging know-how. Samsung brings aggressive R&D and fabrication might. And the market itself is growing fast enough that even smaller players, OmniVision, SmartSense, etc., are getting sizable opportunities. The scale of opportunity outside smartphones is huge, but different. Smartphones still account for over 60% of CMOS sensor revenues as of mid-decade. For perspective, around 6.6 billion image sensor units were shipped in 2023, mostly to smartphones, whereas automotive camera modules were about 236 million units, a fraction in count, but growing quickly. Automotive sensors also often sell at higher average prices than phone sensors. A high-end LiDAR or ADAS sensor can cost far more than a tiny phone, selfie camera, which is enticing for profitability. Both Sony and Samsung are adapting their strategies to these new sectors. Sony has even formed alliances, for example, partnering with NVIDIA to create smart automotive camera platforms, and working with a French startup Prophecy to develop event-based vision sensors, a completely different paradigm of sensor for high-speed detection. Samsung, with its emphasis on AI, might embed neural processing in future security camera sensors, so the camera itself can detect intruders or anomalies without needing a separate computer. The battle is broadening from just who can make the best smartphone camera to who can become the eyes of the machines all around us in the coming AI and autonomous era.